We're placing Shawcross on his scale of evil.
Head injuries can affect judgment and can make a killer, in my opinion, less evil. If he had a head injury that affected the key areas that serve social decision-making, empathy, you got somebody who's going to be more impulsive and care less about the feelings of other people. The first time you had a head injury where you were out cold, how old do you think you were when that happened?
First time I was 15. In high school, when I got struck here
with a discus.
I know when I got struck, I pulled my hands down and blood all over my face, and I just went, boom, gone.
I see him as somebody with very, very impaired impulse control, a tremendous amount of hatred that was going to make him seek vengeance against certain people. In his years of incarceration since 1990, has melted down, from this bigger-than-life picture that scared all of Rochester, New York, and the United States into this overweight, naughty boy.
Arthur Shawcross brutally strangled 11 women, then ate some of their remains. Unlike Ed Gein, Shawcross was not diagnosed as psychotic. Dr. Stone believes Shawcross was conscious of his crimes, so he ranks Shawcross higher than Ed Gein. He places him with other sexually perverse serial murderers who are not psychotic. Arthur Shawcross is a level 17. To Dr. Stone, one thing stands out about Arthur Shawcross: how precisely he fits the profile of a serial killer.
We know now from studying serial killers that there are several factors that seem to predispose the person to do the kind of crimes that they end up doing. But not every serial killer shows all of the features. For instance, there's a genetic predisposition to mental illness, a head injury, and then you have the factor of physical abuse, sexual abuse. When you look at the history of some of the serial killers, you'll see one or two of the factors, but seldom will you see the whole menu. And yet in Shawcross, I think the whole menu is present.
Of all the factors thought to lead to violence, one neurologist believes he knows the recipe.
A person who tortures and murders somebody else. What kind of a person would do such a thing? What is it that makes somebody violent? I've seen well over 100 murderers in the course of my career. What happened? I've examined them thoroughly. What was the worst punishment that you ever had?
Dr. Jonathan Pincus is chief of neurology at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C., a 41-year veteran of medicine and murder. In fact, he examined Arthur Shawcross when he was on trial for killing 11 prostitutes in 1990.
They've done unforgivable things. They still have the range of emotions that all of us do. And the things that they've done as a result of the illnesses that they have and the experiences that they've suffered were the kinds of things that we're capable of. I'm Dr. Pincus. Nice to see you.
Dr. Pincus cannot diagnose someone as evil, but he can examine the area of the brain that consciously decides to commit evil acts, the frontal lobe.
Okay, now here comes the hard part. When my finger goes up, I want you to look to the other side. The frontal lobe doesn't sit all by itself in isolation. It connects with other parts of the brain. When I examine a patient, what I am trying to do is to make different parts of the nervous system work.
The frontal lobe governs our conscious behavior. In a neurological exam, the simplest test can identify brain damage, including the area that controls violent behavior.
A lot of the frontal lobe has been devoted toward eye movements. I'm looking to see that the fellow's eyes move along with my finger. One of the tests I do is visual tracking. A large portion of the frontal lobe is involved in visual tracking. They're called the frontal eye fields. And the person should be able to follow my finger, which is moving slowly. Very good. If his eyes move as my finger is moving, it's normal. But if his eyes don't follow my finger, then that would be abnormal visual tracking, and it would indicate that there was something wrong with his frontal lobe. Very good. Another test I do is a grasp reflex. Okay, now I want you to just relax. I stimulate the palm of the hand and then the fingers. Just relax. And if the person's fingers curl and pull against me, that's an abnormal reflex, and it's called a grasp reflex. Some people only have it when they're distracted. Okay, now spell the word fist.
F-I-S-T.
So I attempt to distract the person by asking them to spell a simple word backwards. Spell it backwards.
T-S-I-F.
And invariably the person becomes inattentive to what I'm doing and sometimes will curl their fingers around mine, in which case it's abnormal.
These simple responses in the hands of Dr. Pincus can become clues. A way to distinguish a patient with an abnormal and potentially violent neurological landscape.
How could the guy be?
A damaged frontal lobe can erase the connections that hold our primal instincts in check.
You can get neurological dysfunction from a head injury, from brain tumor infection. There are hosts of different causes of brain injury. And that produces changes in the person's capacity to exert judgment. Violence does not require a particular etiology. It requires brain injury, brain dysfunction, whether it's temporary or permanent.
All right, please.
In an interesting twist, when Dr. Pincus examined Arthur Shawcross in 1990, he found an unusual cyst in his right temporal lobe. That alone doesn't explain his murderous behavior. But after examining hundreds of killers, Dr. Pincus believes there's a recipe for what makes a serial killer.
People who behave in a manner that could very reasonably be described as evil, a person who tortures and murders somebody else, what kind of a person would do such a thing? What is it that makes somebody violent? We've done a lot of work, and I think it's these three things: abuse, brain damage, and mental illness.
Brain damage and mental illness is the gunpowder, and an abusive childhood lights the fuse.
You take a person who has a basic mental illness, and you torture that person, and beat them. If you do that, you will have someone who wants to get even, who feels that he has been victimized and wants to be empowered, and will do it through some dreadful thing. And because he's not stupid, because he's not so totally brain damaged, he will be able to do it again because he'll be able to cover his tracks. You'll have a serial murderer with that.
There is no consensus on Dr. Pincus's theory, but it is precisely from this cauldron of factors that one of the most evil killers on Dr. Stone's scale of evil emerges.
Gary Heidnik was a man whose crimes would easily overshadow the horrors of Arthur Shawcross and even those of Ed Gein.
On March 24, 1987, Philadelphia police received a call from a hysterical woman. She had just escaped, a sex slave chained for months in a basement. She said 3 survivors were still captive. The basement belonged to 43-year-old Gary Heidnik, and when police entered his home, they knew they were dealing with a twisted mind. Dollar bills lined the hallways. Pennies covered the walls. Grisly discoveries laid ahead. This was a home that had become a sickening laboratory of human torture. In the refrigerator was a human forearm. Flesh clogged the sink. And on the stove, a pot of charred bones. But it was down below, in the basement, where the most evil terrors truly laid.
You got, what's his name coming?
Gary Heidnik had an IQ of a near genius, but his intelligence was channeled into evil, and he was consumed with his master plan. He lured 6 women into his basement and chained them to the pipes. He tortured them with household appliances so they couldn't hear, and blared the radio at full volume to mask any cries for help. He beat them with a shovel, and to prevent them from teaming up, he made them beat each other. He raped them daily.
One was led to ask, was this master plan the act of a madman, or was it so calculated that it could only be the work of pure evil? The only way we can try to understand a man like Gary Heidnik is to look back at his past and to examine the factors that may have created such a person.
Gary Heidnik had an unusual childhood. He grew up in Cleveland and lived with his allegedly abusive father in constant fear of being beaten. His father once disciplined Gary by hanging him by his feet out a 3rd-story window. When Gary wet his bed, his father would hang his sheet out to show the neighbors and humiliate him. After falling from a tree at age 6 and suffering brain damage, Heidnick's behavior seemed to change. Animals he had once nurtured he began to tie up and hang from trees.
Heidnick is interesting because he exhibits so many of the experiences that are common among serial killers. The childhood abuse, for example, animal torture, injuries, and also a history of mental illness.
Gary Heidnick claimed to have delusions throughout his life, once hearing the voice of God as he drove, who told Heidnick to start a church. He installed himself as bishop and held services to a handful of churchgoers just above his dungeon of torture, even as his victims suffered below. Heidnick's master plan was to force all of his female captives to bear his children so he could start a community of his own followers. But as the months passed and none became pregnant, his cruelty became even more extreme. Heidnick experimented with a new torture. He shocked his captives with jolts of electricity. The first captive died of electrocution. Weeks later, a second captive died, this time of starvation. Heidnick put the remains in a blender, mixed them with cans of dog food, then forced the others to consume it.
This is a guy who was consumed by systematic, prolonged torture, not over hours, but months. It was truly the kind of thing that sickens anyone who hears the story.
Heidnick's trial centered on his sanity, and his defense claimed psychosis.
During Heidnick's trial, there was a court psychiatrist who quipped that if there was an Olympics for mental illness, Heidnick would win a gold medal.
But attributing his crimes to mental illness may be too simple.
Heidnick was a much more organized and integrated person despite his grandiosity and peculiarities and moments of mental illness, and he was nowhere near as crazy as Ed Gein.
Heidnick had opened a brokerage account and turned a small investment into more than $500,000, from which he bought a Rolls-Royce and other luxury cars.
You can look at Heidnick's past and see psychosis, you can see paranoia, abuse, all of these things that may have contributed to what he did. But what he did, systematically torturing those women over months, is nothing short of evil.
Gary Heidnick carried out a diabolical plan. He held captive and tortured 6 women in his basement. He murdered 2, one by electrocution and one by starvation. Like Gein, he had a history of mental illness, but like Shawcross, the jury deemed him sane.
He was a scheming torture murderer who was primarily motivated by the enjoyment he got from seeing people suffer.
Dr. Stone considers Heidnick more evil than Ed Gein and Arthur Shawcross because he made his victims endure prolonged torture. Gary Heidnick ranks the highest on Dr. Stone's scale of evil, level 22. Gary Heidnick was executed on July 6, 1999. No one claimed his remains. Ed Gein, Arthur Shawcross, and Gary Heidnick all claimed to be driven by darker forces when they killed, each committing acts more gruesome than the next. Now, real scientific factors like mental illness, psychosis, and neurological damage are being explored in the hopes of better understanding potential killers. Dr. Michael